hear my voice clap 2 times? Works like a charm. If everyone can find their seats, we're going to get started on our first panel of the morning. I don't want to have to call folks by name. All right. Everyone hates when the teacher does that. Right. Right. But our friends in the hallway, if you can grab your second, third, fourth cup of coffee and join us, that would be great. So this is the first time that we're doing this, and it will not be the last because it makes the most sense. But this is a panel that, like I said before, was influenced by a topic of interest that was brought up in our Education Policy Fellowship Program. And I thought it was really important to bring professionals and experts together to further expand on and support the work that was done in that fellowship program. So we'll be doing this from now on. So on our panel, we have a panel around accountability in alternative school settings, different schools, but the same rules, right? And we are joined by Jennifer Baird with the Louisiana Department of Education Office of Assessment and Accountability, Andre Bonifants, principal of the CF Raleigh Alternative School, and Elizabeth Osberg, principal of the Net High School. So can you welcome them? Okay, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper into some of the things that Robin brought up, but before we get into that, I'll let you share with the audience a deeper insight into your role in this landscape. And we can start with Elizabeth.
Good morning, thanks for having me. I am the principal at the Net. We currently have 2 schools in New Orleans. We started about 7 years ago, and we opened a second campus this year. We serve students who have dropped out or been expelled or who have otherwise struggled in a traditional school. So all of our students are over age. Most of our students come to us working at a middle school academic level. About 25% of our students are special education. And our goal is to really change the school environment. So we don't believe that the answer is to either punish the kid or fix the kid because they didn't work in a traditional school. It's really about how do we change the school so it will work for that individual student. So we do a lot of things around project-based learning and internships, a lot of counseling and wraparound supports, and we use an entirely restorative-based process with our students.
Hi, I'm Andre Bonifants. I'm the principal at CF Raleigh. We are an alternative school for behavioral reasons. We are from 6th to 12th grade. My students are notoriously, or historically, I should say, 2 years below grade level. We also have a dropout prevention program when students who, especially our ELL learners, will go to the high school to register, and they're 18 years old and have not been in school since 6th grade. And so they are sent to us, and we do a dropout prevention program with them to try to accelerate them and get them a jumpstart pathway career diploma. And sometimes we fight the odds for that because at some point they will want to go into the work world, and they have to help families and send money back home. So that is something we fight, but that impacts our accountability. We try to keep kids in school and we get them diplomas, and that's our biggest thing. We do use a lot of restorative justice. We use a lot of building relationships. And we also do a 5 days of extra professional development in the summer with our staff only on trauma-informed students. We talk a lot about compassionate schools, part of learning. We are big on parent conferences, parent phone calls. Teachers have to email or call parents on a regular basis and document that to me. We are trying to provide the therapeutic component. Often we feel like we are a day hospital because of the amount of emotional issues that come to us. So we reach out and we depend on the kindness of strangers and people who we know to provide for our kids. But we often fight the therapeutic, the cultural idea of not seeking outside therapy. So we're trying to do that more on our campus to help our students. So there's a number of things that I'll share with you today about how the current accountability metrics hurt us, and a few of the things that we can talk about that would maybe help in all the schools. I know this one lady back here talked about in Orleans specifically, because y'all have so many. I think some of the things that we are doing and some of the things that I've spoken to Katie Barris at the state level about are things that every school would impact every school. And so they would be global, and as opposed to just helping us in St. Bernard. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of time to talk about that as well.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Baird with the Louisiana Department of Education. Just to give you a little background, I was a teacher in a classroom for 10 years. I was a building administrator. I was a district administrator. I was the science supervisor before I was in accountability, and I was very happily distributing worms and butterflies and magnets. And I was called into the office in East Baton Rouge and told that they wanted me to take on a new position that was the director of accountability, and I was just it. That was in 1999. I'm usually really proud that I've been part of Louisiana Accountability since 1999, but now it just makes me sound old. One of the things that's been interesting in working with accountability is that for many years, we have actually had two systems. A lot of people think of the school performance score and the letter grades as part of NCLB. In fact, for many years, that was not really the NCLB plan. It was a state accountability system that was developed prior to NCLB, and the state was very proud of it, hung onto it, and they just added NCLB, the subgroup AYP, all of that stuff, all the AMOs, and attached it. So we actually ran double programs. And while it was separate, the state had a lot more flexibility in what they could do with that accountability model. And over the years, I was called in many times out of East Baton Rouge to come and sit on some state committee to talk about how are we going to arrange alternative education accountability? What are we going to do? How are we going to measure it? We had a number of alternative schools in East Baton Rouge, and they were very diverse. And that was part of the problem in trying to develop accountability models, that they didn't all serve the same purpose. And while many of them in Louisiana do concentrate as discipline schools, places where kids go because they can't go to their regular school, there are other kinds of alternatives out there that are there for overage kids who've gotten 2 years behind. When we were in EBR, it was very easy for a kid to get 2 or 3 years behind with high stakes testing. So there were other kinds of, and those schools didn't take kids with a long discipline record of infraction. They didn't take them. So part of the problem is whenever you build a framework, how does it fit this particular school and this particular model? Last year, we had to implement Act 500. The Louisiana legislature said to the Louisiana Department of Education, you shall create a specialized accountability system for the Office of Juvenile Justice Schools. You shall create measures and you shall make them different. You shall report on them every year. So we met with what we call the Mutual Accountability Team, which is actually the name of the committee in law. And over the course of several months, we designed an accountability system for the Office of Juvenile Justice. It does not replace the one that operates federally. It is in addition to. So part of what you'll see, the sort of friction that goes back and forth across states in Louisiana too, is that some of the things you can propose you can do as a state system as a side-by-side. Here's an evaluation that we can do that's along with the one that we have to do for federal purposes for the USDOE. It's a little bit more complicated to say to the USDOE, we want to do this differently for this set of schools. And part of the reason is because they do represent some of the students that the USDOE actually created accountability for. And that was those underrepresented groups, students with disabilities. And we know, based on our study, and we all knew that for a long time, that there is a high representation of African-American males in alternative schools. There's an overrepresentation of students with disabilities in our alternative schools. And so we have to be thoughtful about how we frame the goals that we have for children in those schools. It was interesting. You want me to stop? It was interesting to listen to Robin because we did some of the very things that she was talking about when we created the alternative measures for OJJ. And I'll just give you a really simple example. When a student earns a high set, there's only one place in the accountability system that awards you for a high set, and that's in there's not just the cohort graduation rate, but there's this other index. And it says, did this kid graduate with a diploma? Did they have an advanced placement test? Did they have dual enrollment courses? Did they have credentials, Jumpstart credentials? You were talking about the Jumpstart pathway. And schools get different points for each of those children based on what they've earned. The only way you get credit for high set is when that student reaches that graduation cohort year. That's the only place it exists. For a lot of alternative schools, that student who gets a high set with them may not ever be part of their cohort. So they get the kid to the high set, but they're never credited for it because of the way the measure is built. And if we take that measure apart a little bit and we say, let's pull this high set out and put it somewhere differently and define the group of kids that we measure differently, then maybe we'll have a little bit of a different picture for this school. And so we have done some of that. This afternoon, I want you all to know that at 1 o'clock, the Accountability Commission is going, which is a branch of the BESI, that's a group that works with accountability rules before BESI looks at them, will discuss some of the things we've been talking about related to all alternative schools. Very, very early stages, very new, very revised discussion, not new. But we'd love for everybody to have input in there. Those meetings are live streamed. And so you could go this afternoon at 1 o'clock. You could go and look and watch what they're talking about. You are always welcome to attend them. So they're taking that on. It's interesting timing, actually, today, with the beginning discussions about this for all alternatives.
Now I'm going to jump in. Thank you. Thank you very much. So that was a lot, but you guys covered some of the other questions that I had today. So Jennifer and Elizabeth, and you might have as well, right? There was an alternative education study group assembled by the Department of Education. I'm sorry. Thank you. So there was an alternative education study group that was assembled by the Department of Education. Last year, that group published a report. So you talk a little bit about who comprised that group, what your task was, and what were the conclusions about what needed to be different about alternative schools and programs. We can start with Jennifer.
So prior to the alternative education study group, the department said, okay, we're going to try this one more time. Let's take this on. Let's see what the state of, before we start talking about alternative accountability, let's just look at the state of alternative schools across our state. Let's understand very completely how they operate, who they serve, how do we hold them accountable, how do these things affect them. The department hired someone new to be dedicated to this because most of us who are working on this project have several hundred more as well. And so we don't always feel like we do as good a job as we should with each of those. And who was Katie Barris that she mentioned. And we assembled a group. And by the way, this report, I sent it over and you've got it for them. And the entire list of people who were on that group are in that report, so if you're interested. And we asked them a series of questions. We tackled different things at different meetings and said, tell us about what you think your needs are for staffing, what your needs are for funding, for resources, for all those kinds of things. And then we looked at the state data around the students that were being served in those schools. Elizabeth, you want to talk about it?
So I think one of the powerful things about the group was they did a lot of site visits. And so they visited our schools, they visited schools all around Louisiana, and they visited schools outside of Louisiana. One of the most important things I think about alternative schools and accountability is I think that people need to see schools and talk to kids, because I think a lot of us have very negative perceptions about what's happening in an alternative school. Many people told me, don't ever use the word alternative when you talk about your school. And I said, but no, alternative means different, and that's good. But there's just very negative perceptions. And there's a lot of belief that you can't run a beautiful school full of love and learning and wonderful kids if you're working with the students that we work with. And so I think getting into sites and seeing what does it look like when it's a great place? What does it feel like when it's a great place? Versus schools you walk into and think, we don't want a child in here ever again.
Katie came to visit our school. We have our associate superintendent and our supervisor of special education who are on the committee. And Katie came to visit our school and met with myself and two of my teachers, my lead middle school teacher and instructional coach, and my dropout prevention teacher, and talked a lot about the dimensions that aren't seen. We don't have fights. We have to overcome that parents' initial fear of, I don't want my child to come to this school. And we literally have fewer fights than the sending schools have. Part of that is because we're so visible, we're so on the kids, we have structure, we supervise them, but we also have expectations of them. And what we have talked about is that if two students get into a fight at our school, part of the reason that they're doing it is because they know I can't back down, but if I do it on the street, somebody might not come along and stop it. If I do it here, we each get one good punch in, and I know that these people are going to take care of me. And so it's kind of a little distorted thinking, but let's think about how some of them deal with their issues already. So they don't lose their street cred, but they've also been very well taken care of. So, but we don't have a lot of fights. And so the fears that many of those parents have when they come into the school and they're sitting there and they're doing their intakes and sitting with me and getting an individualized schedule for their high schoolers so that they can get their diplomas, their opinions often change, but as Elizabeth said, it's getting the people in. No one wants to be president of the Alternative Schools Parents Club. So, we don't have a parent board because no one wants to be there. If they were involved, most of the time their kids wouldn't have been with us. So we have to I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, I just felt the whole room kind of tighten up. That's a huge assumption.
Well, for our parents, I'm speaking of our parents, that for some of them, they would not have their children here if they had been able to go to the school or be more involved. It wasn't a negative, it was just that it's hard to get a parent to come in and want to volunteer or to do those things to help us.
I'm sorry, do you mind if I jump in just?
Sure.
Because you're talking about something that I wanted to segue into. And I think that it will also highlight some of the things that you guys picked up in the audience. So if you read the report, and you can access it online, we have a link to it on the materials for this document. There's a section in there where they talk about a case for studying alternative education programs. And it's really an equity case when you look at the statistics that they're citing. So in terms of who ends up in these schools. Overwhelmingly, I think it's like 16,000 kids last year referred to alternative settings, overwhelmingly Black, male, from low-income families. The students with disabilities overrepresented, 26% in alternative education settings versus 11% statewide. So what I want to shift a little bit, and we'll talk about some of the assumptions that we make around the students that we serve. But I want to shift in terms of how our accountability frameworks and current policy addressing inequities in the entire system that end up, we see a lot of the outcomes ending up in alternative settings. How might this accountability framework that is currently being worked on address some of those things? And anyone can jump in who is working.
One of the things, as I've traveled across the country over the last 15 years or so with accountability, that I noticed is that in Louisiana, the school performance score was kind of this front and center piece of accountability. It really is essentially what NCLB or ESSA were really about. They weren't really about this overall score of a school. They were really about and really created for those groups of kids that they felt people didn't necessarily, didn't have a sense of being able to help in some ways. A lot of teachers just kind of threw their hands up and said, I don't know what to do. I remember every time I heard a sentence that started with these kids, the hair on the back of my head just stood up. And NCLB was really created to address the issue of subgroup inequity. That's really the purpose of it. And so we still have to do that. We are now creating these school performance scores for each subgroup in a school. So while what you hear about all the time out in the world is the school performance score for a single school, they're also getting these school performance scores for each of their groups. And if you go to the school finder, the new school finder, and you pull this up, you can actually see the difference in measures for each of those groups on ACT, on tests, on discipline. Suspensions becoming a piece of how we measure subgroups and how we measure schools. And so we recognize at the department that we would love for things that need to be addressed with kids to be addressed at their school, at their own school, the one they want to go to, their community school, or the one a parent has selected for them, or they've selected. And that we recognize that that's where this begins. That's where this begins at their regular school. I think a couple of things are really important to what's happened with accountability. We have these school performance scores for subgroups. It says you have to pay attention. You can get an A. You can't get an A anymore in the state of Louisiana if your subgroups are failing. That can't happen anymore. So you pay attention to your subgroups. We now have failure for subgroups, and which we always had, but it was kind of downplayed. And now you have to write a plan, and the school has to say, here's a plan, we're gonna give you some money, but your plan has to address your particular data needs, your school subgroups that are not performing well, that they're not doing well. And so one of the things in accountability that just doesn't get mentioned a lot is that that's really what drove it to begin and to exist with USDOE to begin with.
I had a few more questions, but I'm actually going to open it up to the audience. Our time is coming down. I really want to hear from you guys more than my scripted questions. So we will open this up to the audience. Any questions about not just the alternative, the framework for non-traditional settings, but also what's happening in those non-traditional settings? I think both of you can speak to those. So yes, please.
I have a question. Can you all use the microphone so that those of us in the back can hear you? I have a question. Good morning. My question is, I'm not sure that the question was answered, and that one of the questions that was given to the panel was, who comprises the group? And I don't remember hearing a specific answer for that.
The study group?
Yes. Very specifically, who comprises the group?
Who created the group?
Who's in the group? So there's probably about 30 to 40 members. And we have the report in our materials and then where you can see who all of them were, but we can pass this to you. Some of those groups do include, the Urban League was at the table, both of these leaders were there as well. Superintendents were there, so on and so forth. So it was that as a wide ranging group, and it was statewide, correct?
Yes. And then I need to make a statement. My statement is, I'm a retired social worker of having practiced hospital social work for 34 years, so I've seen a lot. And I've also worked in the educational system. But my concern is, as a grandmother and a community person, is that I'm concerned about the language that was portrayed here. The language can cause a huge problem. So I think that one of the things that we need to be cognizant of is how we portray or how we come across, not only to the audience of which you're serving, which is currently, but also to the people that you serve. Because some of the language that was portrayed today, to me, and I'm being as courteous as I can, was very, very negative.
And can you expand on some of those language points?
I think your name is Miss Andre. Am I seeing that right? The middle person? Okay, when you mentioned the fact, and I hope that I'm paraphrasing it right, because I don't want to get it wrong and I don't want anybody hurt, but I also want you to hear me, is that you said something to the effect that the reason why, the parents need to recognize, because this is why some of the children got here, because their needs weren't being met in the first place, and that's how they got there. And that, my experience in working with the systems, that's not true, because in many ways the systems have failed our children. Yeah. And I'm talking from the experience of a grandmother of a 7-year-old child who has been diagnosed, according to DSM-5, as ADHD with mood disorder. Since kindergarten, she's 7 now, and a lot of the services that should have happened have not happened, and we are documenting, calling, writing, and everything else. But that's just an example.
If I could address that,
Thank you.
I don't think I said their needs weren't being met. What we are experiencing, the schools are trying to meet their needs. We get them, and we do try to offer more counseling. What we have been facing.
The statement was in reference to the parents.
And I'm going to address that. Most of the parents we have been dealing with have been parents who have not been involved. That's from my school, and I'm speaking of my school specifically. So we're trying to bring them in. That is one of our goals, is to bring in the parents and help them and to provide them with things that are more school-based that they have not been able to get in the community. We are lacking in the community agencies and outside resources. So we send a lot of people to agencies in New Orleans, and we've been very successful with that. We're reaching out to other community agencies. We have MHSD, we have MHSF, and so we're lacking in the availability in our parish. That's what I was trying to elaborate on. So we are reaching out and trying to bring parents in to help them get those extra services for their kids without having to travel.
But what I'm trying to say is, what I am saying is many times the parents are trying to be involved, but they are not involved, not because they're not motivated to be involved, because they're running into brick walls like my daughter's husband. And my daughter and her husband are running into brick walls.
And I agree. And we're trying to break those walls down. We're trying to help break those walls down.
Right, and
that's what we're talking about.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Thank you, and thank you, Andre. Because one of the things that we do want to emphasize is that our work here is to challenge and change systems. That our work here, and so we just want to be clear that we're laying the onus of responsibility where it belongs.
Basically, I came, and I'm used to these type of topics when it comes to the parent's perspective. I am a parent of 4, so I understand you all are getting this information. But my question to you all is the panel, especially the ones that are running the schools. Do you all create environments that are, I realize there were different learning styles, and I actually had dropped out because schools that I was at were doing the electoral. And as I began to go to college, I realized there were different learning styles. So do you all, at y'all schools, create different learning styles besides the electoral? Because not everybody learns that way.
And I just want to add to that also, when you answer Daphne's question, what does this look like in policy in an accountability framework? Is it currently being measured now? And if not, how do we get it to be measured?
So that's a great question. One of the things that we've done is have a variety of learning settings. So we do some online learning, which for some kids is terrible. They don't like it. And other students love it. They get to go in and work at their own pace and do their own thing and work at home. So we do some online learning. We do some traditional looking classroom. And then all of our English and social studies is a project-based model. And so it's much more hands-on, it's much more student-driven. There's almost no lecture at all. Also, through our internship, students are able to earn credit. And one of the things that's most exciting is when you see a student who's disengaged, who hates school, and then you go out to their internship site and they are doing amazing work. And they're just a completely different person. And how do we harness that back to what they have to do to get their diploma? So it's a really important point. I think in terms of accountability, what that plays into is everything from thinking about, so our students have to get exactly the same credits and pass the same tests as everybody in Louisiana because they get the same diploma. And so where's the flexibility in that? Are there places that we can push around graduation requirements? Are there places we can push around things like seat time? Many of our students have a lot of responsibilities. They struggle with attendance. It's one of the biggest things that they struggle with. And so are there other ways that you can show that you've mastered the content? And so there's lots of little places where I think that we have policy questions. And of course, those add up to the indicators that come out on your SPS or your accountability system.
We have time for one more question. Sorry.
Nolly, can I address that individualized? Because and that goes into the accountability thing. We do after-school tutoring. We have an enrichment program for our middle school during the day where they have extra help on IXL and Lexia, fast math fractionation for skill building. We combine the teacher instruction with that. We do online and teacher instruction for high school. We also are real big on grade recovery. We have a lot of our kids who, when they're sent to us, they might not have been performing well. So we try really hard to help keep them for tutoring, which we provide free transportation, and work with them on where the skills are lacking. A lot of differentiation of instruction for our kids, and our teachers have to do that. We are going to be working this summer with part of our PD is to learn even more ways to individualize instruction for our kids.
One more question over here, and then we'll transition.
Thank you. Hi. So there was a little bit of conversation around disproportionate representation of African American males and of children in special education in alternative settings. To me, these things are pretty well intertwined because there's disproportionate representation of African American males in special education. So this probably is more directed towards Ms. Baird. What are the conversations that are happening around accountability in those spheres? Are there conversations about this at the state, and are there any plans to address this?
Thank you.
Is it working? I would hate to be the person to represent Students with Disabilities Office. I'm probably not going to do a very good job. But what I will say is that we are trying to, based on your previous question, we're trying to recognize that every student is has a different way of learning, has a different way of coping with the world, has a different way of defending themselves, of all those things. We try to be aware of that. I know when I come from a district where that was a very important thing to us, is to understand the cultural differences of kids, to understand that. And as a statewide entity, it becomes a little bit harder to influence that. But what I will say is that between the high school Office of Opportunities and the Students with Disabilities, we've redefined a lot of the ways that we provide services to kids. There are now course choice money. There's tiered curriculums that are that the state identifies, really high quality stuff. We want every student to walk out at the end of 12 years with a head high, being able to be a great parent, being able to be a great neighbor, being able to earn a wage where they can feed their family. Those kinds of things are critically important. And everything we do, no matter what it is, if it's a measure of climate, if it's a measure of curriculum, if it's a measure of any of those things, needs to lead to a kid who leaves us with their head held high, able to be a great parent, a great neighbor, and a high wage earner. And we recognize that that's harder for some than others.
Are there specific plans in place to address that disproportionality, though, of overrepresentation of Black male students? And
Can somebody up there answer?
okay, so we'll follow up and we'll get back to you to see if there are any plans in place to address those inequities and those disparities along racial, gender, and ability lines. But that is our time for this panel. Will you please thank our guests? Thank you very much. And we are behind time just a bit, so we're going to do a very quick switcheroo, and we're going to get into our next panel. Thank you. Thank you very much.